Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the second chapter in Paul's epistle to the Romans. Made it all the way up to the 16th verse. We're going to take it from verse 17 all the way to the end, 29. Before we do that, we just want to review what comes before it. In the first chapter, verses 18 through 32, we read of God's wrath against sin, and then we read of the judgment of sin in the lesson that this lesson is a sequel to, and we're just going to review some of those verses. Verses 1 through 3, Therefore, O man, you who are without excuse, everyone who judges, for in which you judge another, you condemn yourself, since you who judge practice the same. And we know that the judgment of Elohim is according to truth against those who practice such. And do you think, O man, you who judge those practicing such and doing the same, that you shall escape the judgment of Elohim? So the practice, judgmentalness, and just being judgmental is, one of the vices that Christians often succumb to. We think, and Paul's addressing the Jews in this, but it's applicable to modern-day Christians because, we think we're superior because we live by the Bible, but a lot of times we don't live up to the Bible. So one of the things that's consistently communicated throughout the second chapter is that the possession of special revelation is no substitute for the practice thereof. So if you're judging someone else, even for a different sin, let alone the same sin, a lot of people like to point the finger at murderers. They say they never done that, but James 2:10, he who keeps the whole law yet offendeth at one point breaks the whole. And the judgment of Elohim is inescapable, it's inevitable, it must be. And in the fourth verse, we read that, Yahweh in his mercy and kindness and his long-suffering gives us the opportunity to repent, and it's incumbent upon us to make the most of that opportunity. Verses 5 through 10. We're reading these in single this constitutes a single section, this range of verses. But according to your hardness and your unrepentant hearts, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath, and revelation of the righteous judgment of Elohim, who shall render to each one according to his works. Everlasting life to those who by persistence in good works seek for esteem and respect and incorruptibility, but wrath and displeasure to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness. Affliction and distress on every human being working what is evil, of the Jew first and also the Greek, but esteem, respect, and peace to everyone working what is good. So we witness to the dichotomy, to the fact of the inevitable judgment. There are two categories and two camps of people. There's no neutrality, there's no gray area, there's no middle ground. You're either saved or damned and doomed. So we have to, in order to inherit eternal life, we have to have persistence in good works. That just means we have to make it a daily habit and a practice, and not be lax in that practice, lest we incur the divine wrath, which is nothing to look forward to. But that's what must happen if we fail to obey the truth and obey in righteousness, because what did we earlier read? That the judgment of Elohim is according to the truth, verse 2. And the Greek, the Jew first and also the Greek, this parallels verse 116, the operation of salvation comes from the Jew and then spreads to the Greek. So inasmuch as salvation originates from them, so too must they be judged first. So verse 11, there is no partiality with Elohim. So the Gentiles are equally created by him. They are not his chosen people, but they are in the new covenant, because the church, as opposed to the nation of Israel, which was national in charter, the church is pan-national, includes people of diverse ethnic backgrounds, where the Jews were ethnically monolithic. Verse 13, for the hearers of the law are righteous in the sight of Elohim, but the doers of the law shall be justified. So this parallels James 1:22. We read there, much of the same concept is communicated. Hearing is no substitute to doing and practicing. So the possession of special revelation, be it the law, the scriptures, or divinity itself, entails responsibilities. It's a privilege, but with privilege comes an accompanying responsibility. So we are held by these standards which we adhere to, and we have the warnings and consequences, and we will be without excuse if we fail to live up to those standards, having the word of truth made known to us. 16th and final verse of the preceding passage. In the day when Yahweh shall judge the secrets of men through Yahshua Messiah, according to my good news. So Yahweh does the judgment, but it's through Yahshua Messiah, so how we treat him will determine how his Father treats us. If we make him the center of our life, the affection and esteem of our heart, then we will be beloved, treasured, and welcomed into his heavenly homeland, adopted into the family of faith. But if we don't, once more, that dichotomy of judgment, there are two camps, no gray area, no neutrality, no middle ground. You're either saved or damned. And I personally subscribe to the theory that there are degrees of exaltation in salvation. Salvation is not a democracy, it is an aristocracy. Verse 17, lesson itself. See, you are called a Jew, and you rest on the law, and make your boast in Elohim, and know the desire, and approve what is superior, being instructed out of the law, and are trusting that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of foolish ones, a teacher of infants, having the form of knowledge and of the truth of the law. So that takes us all the way to the 20th verse. It's a single sentence. We're going to dissect it and break it down from the top. So because Jews, the law was, the Mosaic law was the Jews' pride, joy, and boast. It made them, it inflated an artificial sense of spiritual superiority over the Gentiles, and it was a marking distinction, and they could boast in Elohim because they were specially related to them. They had something that no other nation had. They had a knowledge and an awareness and a relationship of divinity in its true form. And approving what is superior, the law, there is nothing wrong with the law itself. It is how we treat the law that can do it wrong. Paul writes elsewhere in 1 Timothy 1, 7 or 8 that the law is only good if it is applied lawfully, but it is spiritually superior to be instructed out of the law, and from that instruction, the causational effect of being taught is that you are able to teach. One must learn before they are qualified to teach. And the guide to the blind, light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of foolish ones, a teacher of infants. So this is a reference to the Gentiles because they were considered blind spiritually by the Jewish people. They worshipped idols. They worshipped polytheistic pantheon. Each one was different in each culture and nation, but they did dwell in darkness. They did not have the light of truth because Yahweh had not yet made himself known to them, but it was through the Jewish people that the order and operation spreads to the Gentiles, and the Jewish people were charged to be an evangelical people as early as Genesis 12:1-3, all the nations will be blessed through you, but the Jews were derelict in their evangelical duty, but the earliest apostles were Jews, and so the earliest Christians, they really owe, and we too, we are indebted heirs to them of the Jews. Verse 21, and you then who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who proclaim that a man should not steal, do you steal? So this ties in, this parallels judging those who practice the same thing. Do you practice what you preach, or do you say one thing and do another? So our words and our actions and our behavior must be consistent with our belief in order to be valid and effective and efficacious. So, everyone knows you shouldn't steal, but, the potentiality for people, to proclaim it and even steal or do anything else. There's a whole litany of this. And this section does assume the form of a dialogue. Paul asks and answers rhetorical questions with self-evident answers. You who say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abominate idols, do you rob temples? So adultery is sex with anyone other than your wife or husband, depending on your gender, or sex with another person's spouse. So that's an obvious no-no, a self-evident no-no. It is a breach of faithfulness in a marriage, and it destroys marriage. So it's all well and good to tell others to not do it, but if you yourself are doing are going against the very grain of your teaching, you are effectively worthless and disqualified as a teacher if you do not practice what you preach. And the Jews, to their credit, they struggled with idolatry through their period as an independent nation. The temptation was all around them, all these nations around them, even the nations they didn't fully displace had idols, and that's why Yahweh commanded them to tear everything down, but they didn't exterminate quite everyone, and they had to live with idols. But the robbing of temples became, even though the Jews had collectively purged their idolatrous inclinations as a result of the exile, the practice in the first century, a lot of them, they were commanded to have nothing to do with temples. Don't go near them. Don't associate with people in them. Just stay away from that stuff. But a lot of these idols, they had gold, silver, and valuable material. So the practice of robbing temples was in fact present in first century Judaism. You who make your boast in the law through the transgression of the law, do you disrespect Elohim? So to boast in the law but to not honor it is to disrespect the lawgiver, the one from whom the law emanates, that is Elohim. It is known as the Mosaic law, but Moses is the mere intermediary between divinity and Israel. So if you're making your boast in the law, and that word appears in the 17th verse, make your boast in Elohim. Elohim and the law were the two of the prized possessions of the Jewish people, and the law sprang from, and they're closely connected. The law sprang from and emanated from Elohim. It was his word, his will, special revelation of his nature, will, and character. But the potentiality to fall was always palpable and present. So the Jews did not always live up to the law. They had it, but the possession is no substitute for the practice. Once more. For the name of Yahweh is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it has been written. That was written by Isaiah in the 52nd chapter, 5th verse of the book which bears its name. Paul is quoting from the Greek Septuagint Bible, which was the Old Testament Bible of the Jews once the Greeks became the dominant geopolitical entity and imposed their language and their culture among their subject people. They translated the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, into the Greek language, but what Isaiah was originally referring to was he anticipated their exile in advance of its occurrence, and he knew that the name of Yahweh would be blasphemed amongst the Gentiles because of you. So the Jews had no one but themselves to blame for their exile. They were there because they had failed and dishonored and just violated the terms of the covenant. The covenant was a two-way street. Blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience, and there were ample warnings for the curses. So once more, they were without excuse. And because this is also a reference to their failures in their evangelical duties, the name of Yahweh was blasphemed because they had not influenced the Gentiles, but the Gentiles had culturally imposed themselves upon them because of their own waywardness. And the existence of prophets is actually, once more, it was a privilege and responsibility, but it was also a testament to their own failure, their own iniquity, that all of the prophets that Yahweh sent, with the exception of Jonah, ministered exclusively within the confines of the promised land. Some of these prophets made predictions about other nations, but Jonah is the only one who preached in Nineveh. For circumcision indeed profits if you practice the law, but if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Circumcision was the rite, it was the Jewish equivalent of baptism at the 8-day-year-old mark. This was when Isaac was circumcised, and this practice, we can read that the Messiah did it on the 8th day of his birth too, the infant incarnation in Luke's 2nd chapter. It describes it somewhere around the 20th, after the 22nd verse. But circumcision increased in significance as a result of the notorious Hellenistic tyrant Antiochus IV, surnamed Epiphanius, because what he did is he tried to eliminate the practice of the circumcision. He tried to eliminate the Jewish religion. He had an aversion to all religions. He had an inordinate God complex, and so what he did was he forbade his Jewish subject people from circumcising their children, and this led to the Maccabean rebellion. So they resisted it, and having successfully resisted it, it became even more significant. It increased in significance because it was once almost on the precipice of being lost. But, if you're not honoring the law, then your circumcision is invalid. The circumcision is not a seal of salvation, neither is the law itself. The law is a mirror which exposes the sin and our consequent need for grace and redemption. So you can undo your circumcision. The circumcision is, equivalent to salvation in some sense in this context, in my interpretation. So you can, the Jews thought that circumcision, the physical mark, was their seal of salvation, and just being a son of Abraham automatically qualified them for heaven, but it's a little more complicated than that. So if an uncircumcised one watches over the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be reckoned as circumcision? So an uncircumcised one would have been a Gentile. The Jews were not the only people who circumcised, but it was in the ancient Near East, but it was a special sign of belonging to the one who had ordered it, that being Yahweh. But the Gentile who observes the weightier, incidentally observes without having the benefit of foresight or hindsight of the law, but nevertheless manages to live an ethical, upright life, and their conscience functions as their law, and they will be, his uncircumcision will be reckoned as circumcision. So the Gentile who is obedient to the law without the knowledge of it is of greater esteem and value to Yahweh than the Jew who is circumcised with the law, who treats it trivially, who just discards it, ignores it. Just it's far too simplistic. The road to salvation, demands more than a physical circumcision. It's by the heart that we are judged. And the uncircumcised by nature, who perfects the law, shall judge you, who notwithstanding letter and circumcision are a transgressor of the law. So Yahweh's using these people. The Gentiles were perfectly capable and often of equaling or exceeding the Jews in righteousness, in spite of not possessing the law. But they still had the potentiality through their conscience to live ethical, upright, lives, and they're going to stand as judge over those who had the benefit of the special revelation that they lacked but transgressed it, so they are qualified to judge over them. And this ties into the earlier section of the second chapter where we read of the of Yahweh's judgment and also man's judgment. So judgment belongs to Yahweh. It's an oversimplistic explanation that there should be no judgment in the Christian's life. We are to judge our own, but not, the main sinner we need to keep our eyes focused and fixated on is the one in the mirror. For he is not Jewish who is outwardly, neither is circumcision that which is outward of the flesh. So external or physical or carnal acts, or even just legalism, more broadly speaking, is worthless compared to internal virtue, the virtue of the heart, the virtue of the spirit. So we cannot measure our righteousness by acts of the flesh and marks of the flesh or physical or carnal insignia. Salvation is it's a matter of the heart, and righteousness too. It's a matter of the heart, the spirit, the mind, all coordinated in one, directed towards the same purpose. 29th and final verse. But a Jew is he who is inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in spirit, not literally, whose praise is not from men, but Elohim. So the true qualifying factor of a Jew worthy of the name, was not the external observance of circumcision, but inward, in the heart, circumcision of the heart. Moses calls for this as early as Deuteronomy 10:16, I believe. Or, somewhere thereabouts. But Jeremiah also speaks of it in the 4th verse of the 4th chapter in the book which bears his name. The circumcision of the heart, remove the foreskin of your heart. So every penis has a foreskin, which is removed through the process of circumcision. And we have to, the temptation is, do we want to be man pleasers or do we want to please Elohim? Because, we can get far ahead in the world if we are man pleasers, and obedience to Elohim is no guarantee that we will have advance in worldly station or in the esteem among men. In fact, we are all but virtually guaranteed to be despised, rejected, and ridiculed by the war which is against him. But we have to prioritize. We cannot be fearful of rejection of men, because the thing we have to be fearful of is the rejection of Yahweh and Elohim, the one who matters, the one who judges, the one to whom we all must answer to, whether Jew or Gentile. So I hope that's one of the reasons you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Take care until next time. Bye-bye.